Welcome to George MacDonald and Us. This is Catherine.
And this is Sean.
And we are a married couple out of rural Minnesota. And this is our first episode of the George MacDonald and Us podcast. So we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to any listeners who are checking this new thing out. We hope you find something for you in this podcast. For those of you who may not know who George MacDonald is, he was from Scotland. He was born in 1824 and he died in 1905, so he lived around that time. And he was a Scottish author, poet, and Christian congregational minister. He's not very well known, but really inspired some of the well-known authors, British authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and even Lewis Carroll. And I just found out recently that he was friends with Mark Twain. And so he had a lot of influence in literary circles, but he himself, I feel like, isn't super well known. I found out about him when I read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. He is a character in that story by C.S. Lewis. Sean, how did you find out about him?
I first read his essay on justice, and that was very intriguing for me, and I thought there was a lot of wise insight, and maybe someday we will share a little bit more about how that affected our relationship. And when I read that and shared it with Katie, and so George MacDonald has had an impact in our life and our marriage, and well, I'm sure in future episodes we will have more on that.
Yeah, so stay tuned. There's always more coming. Basically, the structure of this podcast is we are going to choose a work by George MacDonald, and we're going to read that for you. And we want to read it for you because we think that it's really important that these works are known. We don't just want to talk about George MacDonald. We actually want to get George MacDonald's actual works and stories out there. And in the culture, I think about how stories have shaped cultures. I mean, fairy tales grew up out of culture and shaped them. Every culture has its own myths, its own songs, and I think that they're just being told less and less and sadly just being forgotten, or we analyze them instead of actually telling the story. And I think that the story itself is the most important thing. And I just want to say too, we're going to start out with his poetry and his short stories, his fairy tales, but we would like to move on to his sermons too. And we might even have to do some of his larger stories and works in pieces. So we will first read his work aloud on the podcast, and then Sean and I are going to basically have a discussion about it as we would any other day, like just if we were to read something together of his and talk about it. And that's kind of how the inspiration or the idea of this podcast came about, is that we were doing this exact thing. And then I said, well, hey, why don't we just record it and make a podcast out of it in case other people find it insightful.
So today, the first work that we're going to be reading is one of our favorite poems titled King Cole, and I will read it now. King Cole he reigned in Arrow land, but the scepter was seldom in his hand. Far oftener was there his golden cup. He ate too much, but he drank all up. To be called a king and to be a king, that is one thing and another thing. So his majesty's head began to shake, and his hands and his feet to swell and ache. The doctors were called, but they dared not say, Your Majesty drinks too much Tokay. So out of the king's heart died all mirth, and he thought there was nothing good on earth. Then up rose the fool, whose every word was 3 parts wise and 1 part absurd. Nuncle, he said, never mind the gout. I will make you laugh till you laugh it out. King Cole pushed away his full gold plate, the jester he opened the palace gate, brought in a cold man with hunger grim, and on the day's edge seated him. Then caught up the king's old golden plate, and set it beside him. Oh, how he ate! And the king took note with a pleased surprise, that he ate with his mouth and his cheeks and his eyes, with his arms and his legs and his body whole, and laughed aloud from his heart and soul. Then from his lordly chair got up, and carried the man his own gold cup. The goblet was deep and wide and full. The poor man drank like a cow at a pool. Said the king to the jester, I call it well done, to drink with 2 mouths instead of 1. Said the king to himself, as he took his seat, it is quite as good to feed as to eat. It is better, I do begin to think, to give to the thirsty than to drink. And now I have thought of it, said the king, there might be more of this kind of thing. The fool heard. The king had not long to wait. The fool cried aloud at the palace gate. The ragged and wretched, the hungry and thin, loose in their clothes and tight in their skin, gathered in shoals till they filled the hall, and the king and the fool they fed them all. And as with good things their plates they piled, and the king grew merry as a little child. On the morrow early he went abroad, and sought poor folk in their own abode. Sought them till evening foggy and dim, did not wait till they came to him. And every day after did what he could, gave them work and gave them food. Thus he made war on their wintry weather, and his health and the spring came back together. But lo, a change had passed on the king, like the change of the world in that same spring. His face had grown noble and good to see, and the crown sat well on his majesty. Now he ate enough, and he ate no more. He drank about half what he drank before. He reigned a real king in our land, reigned with his head and his heart and his hand. All this through the fool did come to pass, and every Christmas Eve that was, the palace gates stood open wide, and the poor came in from every side. And the king rose up and served them duly, and his people loved him very truly.
You know, when I first read this poem, I just sort of felt, you know, it's called King Cole, and there's that nursery rhyme, old King Cole was a merry old soul, and a merry old soul was he. He called for his pipe, and he called for his bowl, and he called for his fiddlers 3. And I think it goes on. I think there's more. But when I was reading this poem, this King Cole isn't so merry.
No, and it's not King Cole, C-O-A-L, but it's King Cole, C-O-L-E.
Yeah,
so
that's the same as in the fairy tale, or in the nursery rhyme.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the scepter was seldom in his hand, far oftener was there his golden cup. He ate too much, but he drank all up. To be called a king and to be a king, that is one and another thing. So he's just not the King Cole that's merry and calling for his pipe and his bowl and his fiddlers 3 to me. I mean, this is a very different King Cole, as I said, and he's kind of a sorrowful fellow. I mean, his hands and feet began to swell. His Majesty's head began to shake. The doctors were called, so he's sick, and out of the king's heart died all mirth. So I just wonder why George MacDonald chose to have this take particularly on King Cole. I mean, I assume he's using that same old nursery rhyme, but I don't know. But that just struck me as kind of peculiar, why he took a merry king and made him sad.
Yeah. Yeah, I not thought about that. That's interesting. But he's definitely a man that's caught in, the worldly possessions and passions and unable to fulfill his duty as a king. And I find it very interesting that it's the fool or the jester that is more of the merry one, while they are typically kind of merry, I guess. But he's the one that really opens the king's eyes, and I find that pretty interesting and enlightening. One of the lines at the end, that all this through the fool did come to pass. Yeah. It's kind of a powerful line that maybe you don't really hear something like that often.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because when I think George MacDonald is really maybe approaching what it actually means to be a king. I think we think of kings as having a lot of wealth and power and riches. But here, that's not what a king is in this poem for George MacDonald. And I'm paying attention to how his head is described and his feet and his hands. And when I think of like the head, I think like symbolically or traditionally, the head is like the ruling faculty of the body. We speak of Christ as head of the church. It's sort of the ruling, the organizing part, and then the hands and the feet work to embody what the head is trying to put out or trying to, organize and bring about. And it feels like, well, his head is shaking, so there's no real organizing faculty happening in this head. And by organizing, I almost mean like tending to a garden, like not a tyrannical organizing or a rigid, boring organizing, but a cultivating organizing. And then his hands and his feet are swelling, so they're not embodying anything either. And so those elements of kingship are lacking, and it's not. Yeah, his kingship isn't defined by his food and his wealth. I just also want to think about what's the problem here, and he's eating and he's drinking. And I'm an amateur Jungian. I mean, I don't even want to call myself a Jungian, I guess. I like Carl Jung a lot. And in Jungian understanding, like Marion Woodman, who was a Jungian analyst whom I really admire, she talks about how food can symbolize the mother, and then spirit or drink can symbolize the father. And I don't know what kind of drink he's referring to here. I guess.
Yeah, 2K. I'm not sure what that is. I guess TOKAY.
Yeah, maybe one of our listeners will know. Anyway, if we think about it as matter and spirit, these are things that the king is struggling with, matter and spirit. And Jung connects those to the mother and the father. So there's something within the king that's lacking, that he's compensating for by consuming. And yes, I mean, the remedy is the fool.
Yeah, and there's something within the king that is there that, is riled up from seeing the man eat that the fool brings to him. So there's some goodness inside of him that just needs to be brought out.
Right, so the fool brings forth a poor man.
Yeah. And it's the way that the poor man eats that's really this inciting incident, which reminds me of my favorite podcaster, Jason Jones, talks about the inciting incident quite often, and all of the guests that he brings on is typically his question to them is, was there an inciting incident in their lives that changed the course? And he himself describes his quite often, of having his high school girlfriend being forced into an abortion from her father, and that's what ultimately changed the course of his entire life and got him into his work that he's doing today. So I really like that this poem shows that there can be some very, very powerful inciting incident that ends up changing the course of, in this case, the king's actions, and even pushes him beyond cleaning up his act and not eating and drinking too much, but seeking out the poor in other lands even. And I think that's very powerful for us today. That I know myself, I think about this quite often, that is there an inciting incident in my life, or what would that be? Should it take an inciting incident for me to be better or do something that's more worthwhile with my life, or something different? I think of parents that have had children with a disease or something, and they end up becoming champions and of finding cures for those diseases and setting up foundations. And I admire those people that do that type of work without having an inciting incident in their life. So I think it's just worth pondering that if there's been an inciting incident in your life, or what would that be in your life too, I think is worth thinking about a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think Jung talks about how there's gold behind the shadow, and yeah, I mean, we can even, I think we can even do that in our own inner work, thinking about even just like ourselves on a day-to-day basis. I mean, if something happens that really frustrates you or makes you sad or really gets your attention, to say, where did that come from? Like, when was the first time I felt that way about something? And just try to be really curious about what gets our attention. Yeah, what are the inciting incidences, even like on a microcosm level. Here's a question, because I think we made a jump from like, so the fool, I mean, he's supposed to be funny, right? And he even says, I will make you laugh till you laugh it out. That line struck me as like, what is it?
But is he trying to be funny? Because he doesn't do any jokes or anything funny.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is the fool typically is somebody who tells the truth through humor. I mean, I think the purpose of the fool was to keep the king's ego and pride in check. And so the fool had to be honest, but he had to do it in a way that wouldn't offend the king or the queen. So he was always like walking this tightrope of like, I don't want to overstep my bounds, but it is like my job to tell the uncomfortable truth. And I think a great example of a fool who does that is in King Lear in Shakespeare. I would really recommend reading that as sort of like, for me, it's sort of the epitome of a fool character. But okay, I mean, so the fool is saying like he's going to make him laugh till he laughs it out, and then he proceeds to bring in a poor man to eat his stuff. And so I'm just wondering, is there an element of humor in the way that the poor man eats, like eating with two mouths instead of one? I mean, there's nothing funny about he's described as a cold man with hunger grim. There's nothing funny about that.
No, I almost think of the fool as, in this scenario, almost being more of, like, kind of a cunning, thoughtful person, because there's a line that says, the doctors were called, but they dared not say. So the doctors did not have the courage to tell the king what his true, issue was. And the fool didn't say it either, but he did say it in a certain way, maybe in a different way. He was cunning enough to maybe get that message across, but not using humor. I guess I don't see that in my mind, but being maybe a little bit more strategic or
well, right, yes, I mean, you're right, that is the balancing act of the fool, is to, yes, be cunning. You're right.
Yeah, and there is an element of courageousness in that too, that no one else has around the king, it seems, in the story.
Yeah. I guess now that I think about it a little more, Marie-Louise von Franz, she was a Jungian analyst as well, and she does a lot of fairy tale analysis. And I remember her talking about how the fool in the fairy tale traditionally chooses death. So if there are, a couple of journeys or roads to take, the knight will take the road that doesn't lead to death, but it ends up being his demise anyway. And then, the merchant will take the other road that doesn't lead to death, and it'll end up being his demise. But it's the fool who looks at the road that clearly leads to death and says, that's the one I'm going to take. And then he ends up being successful and triumphant. And, I mean, when I think about this, the poor man that he brings in, a cold man with hunger grim, I mean, there is an element of death here. I feel like it's almost like the fool is bringing in death, bringing the king into that awareness almost, and choosing that route.
I wonder if that would have been viewed as offensive to bring someone in like that to a king. Yeah. In this context. If that in itself would be a very risky thing for a fool to do or a jester to do, I'm curious. It could be. And as you were talking about choosing death, maybe it doesn't really exactly say what happens to the fool, I guess, at the end here. Yeah. But there is a line about halfway through where the king had said there might be more of this kind of thing, and the fool heard, and the fool cried aloud at the palace gate. So the fool did go on to help the king in his mission going forward, but I think that's the last that we hear of the fool. So it's interesting to think about.
It is, and then...
Or no, it does say one other line, and the king and the fool, they fed them all. Okay. So he did do this with the king.
He did, and it's almost like the king... So the king has a change of heart in the story, in the poem, and he becomes like a little child, and he feeds them, and then he goes, the king, it says, and sought poor folk in their own abode, sought them till evening foggy and dim, did not wait till they came to him. So he's doing kind of what the fool is doing at this point. He's choosing what the fool chose. He's seeking out what the fool sought, which is interesting. Which is the poor. And I do sense there's just a lot of really grim imagery in this poem used to describe the poor, loose in their clothes and tight in their skin. And I was thinking, what does the poor really symbolize in a story? If we don't look at this super literally for a second, what is it to be poor symbolically, and in our own inner world? I do think of vulnerability and death, and as a king, I don't think you are thinking about your own vulnerability all that much. But he had it. We know that he had it because he was trying to cover it up with drink and food. Mother and father are protect us from being vulnerable when we're little. And he evidently didn't have a very strong, I'd say, inner mother and father. And so he turned to the food and the drink to compensate for that. And perhaps because he was afraid of his own vulnerability, his own death. And the fool's answer to that is to nourish, to go out, to find, the vulnerable, and to nourish it, and to care for it, and to feed it. And I think that can be applied to all of us as well.
Yeah, I find it really cool in this story too that with the king, it was really simple that just by doing this and helping the poor, he basically healed, because it says at the end he reigned with his head and his heart and his hand. So it totally came within him and righted his inner his mind and everything. So I like that part of the story a lot, because it's an example of how service to others can be so rewarding in many ways. I think not in ways that maybe you would think. I mean, what would that have to do with reigning with your head as a king, really? But something translates from service to being better at that. And maybe that's part of leadership, is serving others. I think without that, it's difficult to be a good leader. But why is that? I'm not 100% sure what translates there, but something definitely does.
Yeah, I mean, why is it that the fool is the one who chooses the path of the death and then is rewarded for it? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I love how George MacDonald repeats the head and the heart motive at the end, that now he is ruling. He reigned with his head and his heart and his hand. So in the beginning, those things were off kilter, right? His head was shaking, the hands and the feet were swollen. So there's no organizing principle in the head. There's no reigning power in the head, and then nothing is being embodied. But now everything, like there's that ruling, that kingship, and his heart and his hand. There's that embodiment of it. And we were just listening to someone else that we really like, Dr. Malcom. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Guite. Okay, Dr. Malcom Guite. We were listening to his talk on C.S. Lewis at Ulster University's first annual C.S. Lewis Symposium. It's on YouTube. And he was talking exactly about embodiment. And I just have to share this quote. He says, "The whole purpose of the imagination is to take something which we would otherwise have not comprehended or got hold of and give it a body, give it a bodily form." And I think these days we're too dualistic in how we look at stories, how we would look at this poem. I think we might think, oh, this is just a nice poem or a dark take on King Cole, like he's actually a gluttonous drunk. And but I think what we're finding now is that there is a movement, both in Christianity and as Carl Jung is kind of getting more popular now and out there, that we're saying, no, like there is a unity here. There is a body-soul unity that permeates the cosmos, that permeates ourselves, and it's reflected in our stories. and that there isn't this dualistic split between these two. And I just think that this poem, ironically, we chose it as our first one, but I think this poem is really what this podcast is going to be all about. I think we're going to find a lot of examples in the works of George MacDonald where he uses imagination and poetry and art, the art of words, to embody a truth, to make it present before us. Dr. Malcom, quotes Shakespeare. He thought the same thing. Shakespeare wrote in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 5, "The poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name." And then Dr. Malcom, and I think C.S. Lewis does the same thing in Surprised by Joy, says this is what the Gospel of John is all about, when he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So I think as we read these poems, these stories, these works by George MacDonald, we're going to really dive into how they are embodying a truth and how we see this truth being embodied from our perspective, and how that reflects the Logos, Christ, and St. Maximus the Confessor's statement that the cosmos itself is a reflection of Christ.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I also think one reason why I like George MacDonald so much is a lot of what he says is challenging or contrary to what you've maybe thought of in the past. And I think in this poem, he's challenging you to be the jester as well as the changed king, I believe, and not the doctors that weren't, speak the truth, and not the king before, he changed. And I don't know of any other stories that challenge you to be the jester, I guess, or to be the fool. And I think that's classic George MacDonald, is kind of challenging you to be something that you wouldn't have thought to be. And it's even in his theological writings. There's an element of that often with him, that it's just he says things in ways that you've not heard before, but has, I think, clarity to it that I've never heard or read someone before. And I'm excited to read some more of these works and find some more things like this to see what else he has to say.
Yes. I really love what you said there. You're right. I mean, we are called to be the fool and the king in this story. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And how that's just not in our culture to be the fool. And maybe it never has. I mean, I think about, so a little bit about myself, I guess, we're Western Christians, we're Roman Catholics, raised on it. And the past few years, I have really come to grow in and appreciate the Greek or the Eastern Antiochian Orthodox way. And I'm pursuing studies in it through the Antiochian House of Studies. And I just love it. And I love studying the early church fathers. And I love really, really looking at what the East emphasizes. And it's beautiful. And it's just funny how it feeds off of each other, though, because as I look closer at the East, I'm also looking at the West a little differently too. And I do think one of our great gifts as a Western tradition is the fool, is John the Baptist. Not that he's a product of the Western tradition, But I think what we in the West have particularly focused on with St. John the Baptist, and the East does this too in its iconography, but I think his character, his persona, St. John the Baptist, I think has a bit of the fool element in it. I mean, he's the wild man eating locusts and honey. He is challenging the king, right? That's what gets him in trouble. I guess he's not coy or funny enough, but he is the fool and he chooses death. And I think that the West in particular has this gift of really taking John the Baptist and putting him, if not him directly, like I say, who he is symbolically. I mean, I think about how the fool turns up in this poem. Shakespeare wrote a lot about the fool. He's in fairy tales all the time. And Tolkien, man, I just feel like Tom Bombadil has a lot of the fool element, and there he is right at the beginning of The Hobbit's journey. Anyway, I mean, the West has always been known as kind of being this untamed, wild thing. You read Anna Karenina's the Alexiad, and the way that the Eastern Byzantines saw the Westerners, it was just like, yeah, you guys are ridiculous and unruly. And I think that there is an element of the fool just in our heartbeat, in our veins, and I think he's going to turn up again here. And I think he is so important for us to be. But I don't know how to be him. It's a journey.
Yeah, I'm excited to read some other stories that maybe we'll understand that more.
Yeah, right. We'll learn more about the fool and how he's embodied. All right. Well, I guess this wraps it up for this first episode. I hope you enjoyed the poem. I hope you check it and other references we made in this podcast in the show notes. And I hope you got something out of our discussion about it together. If you liked this, we do have a Patreon page where you can support us. We have different levels of support that you can sign up for. There, the lowest one is $3 a month. So if you like our content, hop on over to Patreon. We are titled George MacDonald and Us. It's the same title as our podcast. So please consider supporting us on Patreon. But above all, please do share this podcast with your friends and family if you enjoyed it. And please do check back, as we hope to have regular episodes coming out, at least on a monthly basis, if not more. So
yeah, and print it out and read this poem to your kids. It's a perfect length for bedtime.
Yeah.
I think the more that we can get our kids or grandkids exposed to these works would be fantastic. And our kids have loved it so far, the few times I've read it to them. So I think I'm always looking for stories or poems this length that don't take too much time but have good messages. So,
and what's great about stories that use these very ancient modes of imagery with kings and jesters and the poor, and oh man, there's just so much imagery in here, is that you don't need to explain it to them because these are images that are in their hearts already.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Don't feel like you have to explain anything. They'll probably explain it to you, and they'll probably be spot on. I've always loved Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. I'm such a nerd when it comes to those guys. And I'm actually looking at a picture of me and a friend kneeling at St. Louis's grave right now. I have that posted up here in our little office area here. And they've just meant so much to me in my life. And I've never really thought about George MacDonald in the he's always just kind of been like in the shadowy background, I guess. I mean, I knew he was important to these guys and influenced them, but sometimes when I read him, I was like, I just don't really, this is what influenced Tolkien and Lewis. Like, I didn't see it. So anyway, I'm really excited to like grow in my love and appreciation for George MacDonald, because I think he, like, if you've ever seen a picture of George MacDonald, he looks like John the Baptist. I mean, he has this huge beard. I mean, he looks like the Fool, maybe, you know, or he's just like that counter, you know, like, I don't want to say countercultural as in like to put him in a box as being like this, I don't know, hipster man or something, but maybe he's the original hipster. I don't know. Or he's definitely an authentic person. And I think in his authenticity, he's the Fool, kind of. Yeah. All right. Well, take care. Check out our Patreon page, and please come again. We enjoy having you. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.